wages. It is the morning show, and I would like to welcome onto the programme the Minister of State for Food, Forestry and Horticulture. That's our very own Andrew Doyle. Fine Gael, good morning to you, Andrew.
Morning, Declan.
Good morning. Good to talk to you again. So a couple of things that have arisen this morning, but number one here, the main headline in the Irish Independent, and this is around the Fair Deal scheme. Now, this scheme has been highlighted during the week because of that very moving documentary by Brendan Courtney, and he was calling into question, and their family was, and other people took it up, about in the home, that people could be looked after in the home, which would save a lot of money, but it wasn't available. And then there was the parallel story that certain people in the farming community were, in a way, what should I say, dumping? No, maybe having people in hospitals rather than in nursing homes in order to avoid any fair deal scheme, because they were afraid of the assets of the farm being given away to the state to pay for that nursing home care. Well, according to the Independent today, farmers are going to be, to a large degree, excluded from that requirement in the fair deal scheme. Can you explain it to us?
Yeah, there's a lot involved in what you've just outlined there. I suppose the first thing is, in the Fair Deal scheme was introduced by Mary Harney at the time, and it's inherently a good scheme. I think it was to be reviewed in 2011. That didn't take place in 2015. And just to explain the way it works, I suppose, if somebody goes in to a nursing home, 7.5% of the net value of the value of the family home is taken for a maximum of 3 years, so it's 22.5%, but no greater than the cost of the care. Now, in just to clarify that one point, is if it's a married couple and one person goes in, it's half of it. But in any event, so 22.5% of the value of the family home is calculated then for the purpose of reimbursing the state. In the case of, and it's important to point out, there's not just farms, it's small businesses and sole traders as distinct from companies. So somebody with a shop or garage that's a sole trader or whatever is in the same boat. The entirety of their asset is included for evaluation, not just the family home, and there's no cap of 3 years. So if somebody was in for 10 years, then that's 70% of the asset can be used to pay down. Now, in reality, there's no, very few farms or small businesses that can actually afford that. I mean, there is the provision that if the asset is divested 5 years prior to the end of the nursing home, that's not then part of it. But in many cases, traditionally, I suppose, it's been a problem, and let's acknowledge that farm owners in particular have been slow to sign over to the next generation. It's something that does need to be looked at. But notwithstanding that, I think it's important that everybody's treated equally, so that the family home, sure, 7.5% a year, and if that's a family home over a shop or in a farm, that's fine. But not the entire working asset, which is the livelihood as well, because it just means that somebody is no longer going to be able to continue that livelihood. That's the reality of it.
Right, so you think that it is fair that the entity of the business, in this case a farm, but as you say, small business as well, is left as a whole. Mostly, I think they were talking about 90% though, were they?
Well, the reason for that 90% was that, capital acquisitions tax, if you qualify as a qualifying, in farmer's case, qualified farmer, if it's a business, I'm not sure if you qualify, but if you were inheriting a business or a farm, 90% of the value of the relief is discounted, and then the rest is calculated. That's a simpler way in many ways, but it's actually, people have different opinions on it. But in my opinion, if everybody was treated the same, in other words, the family home is the family home, and if the family home is part of because when they calculate, by the way, that 90%, it has to be that at least 80% of the asset is agricultural. So the family home is not agricultural. So it's easy enough to section that off and say we take this 7.5% for 3 years as part of the calculation, and then reimburse the state with that amount, rather than 100%, possibly up to 100% of the total working assets.
So ultimately, could the family home, which could be on the farm, be in a different ownership than the actual farm?
Yes. Oh, yeah. No. That. Yeah. Well, it could be in the ownership of the person who's actually gone into the nursing home. But the point is that if the land part or the business part hadn't been passed on to the next generation more than 5 years prior to them going into the home, it still counted. And that's the bit of forward planning that people really have to look at as well. But for certain cases, it's like somebody has stroke or whatever and ends up in a nursing home long term. It's that you couldn't foresee. And someone relatively young, relatively young nowadays is 70.
Yeah.
And they could still technically have owned it or owned it in the previous 5 years, and in an unplanned scenario end up in long-term care. So I suppose, like, nobody's looking for a loophole. They're looking for an anomaly to be addressed. And this review was undertaken by the then Minister Leo Varadkar, and there was a number of recommendations. So it was meant to be completed by last year, but I suppose there was a lot of things delayed, a lot of processes in 2016, and it is, it's actually very useful, I think, that documentary that featured Brendan Courtney has come to light to highlight what many of us have been saying needed to be addressed for years.
Right, so the farming will be sorted out. Presumably home care will be looked at as well.
Home care actually is the best value. Home care, I think we need to look at funding that through a similar sort of model, and that with you adopting the same principles, because, like, there's no doubt, but the first preference should be to try and keep the person, one's family member in the family home. It's better value for money. It means that there's more capacity, and so more people can go into nursing homes less, and you take more people out of which I disagree with, by the way, the HSE's assertion that people are just leaving people in beds to avoid the whole charge, on a nursing home. So would you free up the system by doing it that way?
Right. Okay, two quick things just to ask you. On Brexit, the Food and Drink Organisation in Ireland, and indeed grain farmers, looking for some support. I know grain farmers is more the weather, but support's being looked for because of circumstances. But food and drink industry saying, sterling depreciation, we need a bit of help and all that. Do you think that will be forthcoming?
Well, there's a couple of things gone on. I suppose that there's a reckoner that there was up to 500 million wiped off the value of agri-output, value of exports to the UK as a result of the Brexit decision, notwithstanding the fact that volumes went up by about 5%. So it certainly has presented serious challenges right across the system. And my colleague Michael Creed has been over with his counterpart in the UK, with the CEOs of all the major retailers, like Tesco are in the UK are one of our biggest. They are our biggest customer for beef, and in particular. So we have to continue to work with them for many of the sectors, especially probably the arable tillage and in particular mushrooms. There was a request for working capital, so the low interest working capital loan, flexible loan scheme, which is due to be announced by the end of the month, will provide that sort of working capital that can clear merchant credit, bank overdrafts, which are very expensive, and 6 years with 3 years option of interest only. So that's one product. The specific case that you're talking about was brought by somewhere between 250 and 350 farmers in specific areas and for a couple of different reasons, but all related to the weather for serious crop loss. There was private members last night. The government counter-motion said that they're going to reconvene this tillage forum and look at alternatives, but to assess how the uptake on the low-interest loan fund was working first. Now, it won't work for everyone, and we realise that, but there are state aid rules which, limit the number and the amount of ways that actually support can be given. But look, it's an ongoing review of it's a movable feast really at the moment, so we're trying to keep abreast of it, and it's our intention to try and support that industry. And a lot of the people that actually have suffered the crop damage are people that would be smaller growers who grow for their own feed, for their own animals, so that's an important aspect we don't want to lose.
Thanks for that. Just one last thing. It's a local one, really. It's Lara's post office. And last week we were talking to your colleague Deputy Pat Casey of Fianna Fáil, and after that there was a text in that said Pat Casey was talking both sides of his mouth. Is Pat Casey not a member of a political party that props up a government that supports the closing of rural post offices? He can't have it both ways. So he's getting at Pat, but you are got a side swipe in there as well, that you're a member of a government that supports the closing of rural post offices.
No, that's not true. In fact, if you look at the statistics and the number that were closed in the 5 years up to 16, during the last government's term, it was something like 48 as opposed to 180 in the previous 4 years. So, regardless of what we say about the numbers, unless the Post and the post office system is going through, a real transition because of the way that people do business. And Pat Rabbitte, for that reason, commissioned Obligare to do a report which is about to present the recommendations for implementation. Now, I don't know that can save all of the post office, but in the case of the Lara Glendalough, and I was at a meeting Monday night, it's apparent that people were unaware of the fact that it was intended to close the office at the end of this month, and that no one had an opportunity to put in an expression of interest. So we've been in touch with Post and them to engage with the locals. The locals have undertaken to, do a trial to see if there's somebody who would be interested in extending the contract, even for 1 year, to prove whether or not it's viable to somebody else. And it is a reasonable request, as far as I'm concerned.
Right, so the intention is to try and keep it over.
has, of all the places, if it was an ordinary rural village is one thing, but this is Lara Glendalough is probably one of the most busiest visitor attraction destinations in the country. So, for a post office, with, imagination, I suppose, and looking at developing other little businesses around it, it could actually be viable, I think. I personally believe it could.
Right.
But it takes a lot of commitment. My late mother-in-law was a postmistress, and I know what balancing books at night are, every night and once a week, and it was hard work, and a lot of commitment,
Yeah, but the intention is to try and keep it over. Absolutely. At least this one, irrespective of what might happen with other post offices around the country after the Obligare report. Okay, Andrew, thanks for your time. We'll talk again. Thank you.
Thanks, Declan. Thank you.
That is Minister of State for Food, Forestry and Horticulture, Andrew Doyle, there on a few issues. And if you want to read more about the Fair Deal scheme, farmers, the big winners in Fair Deal overhaul, that the farm and indeed people with small businesses would remain with those businesses intact, even though the family homes would be up for consideration with the Fair Deal. One texter, his says here, it just goes to show the Fine Gael only care about those who have plenty. This new measure exempting farmers is unacceptable. Joe Soap never gets a look in. If you've got a view on that, they're welcome at 087 77 11 103. We hope to catch up about this phone that comes with the